When the Romans invaded Britain in 55 BC, it was not long before they had discovered hidden gems in the English Channel, the native oyster. The Roman historian Sallust famously said, "The poor Britons, there is some good in them after all, they produce an oyster." Whitstable is famed for its native oysters, and much of the local industry reflects this. The Sea Salt Shellfish Company was established 150 years ago on the town's coastal flatlands. In its heyday, hundreds were employed in harvesting and selling the Whitstable oysters, supplying London and Europe. But in recent years, disease, pollution and overfishing have resulted in declining stocks. In 1966, the company created an artificial hatchery. Company owner and zoologist John Bays has worked with oysters for over 40 years and pioneered methods of artificial breeding.
Because we had become very good at breeding oysters, we took to specialising in that. For a while we were the world leaders and probably will be again soon. We can produce an awful lot, and there's a big demand for park-grown oysters, especially in France, but elsewhere also. And we're quite good at producing those. So we tend to grow an oyster to about the size of a walnut and sell it to other growers to finish.
Sea Salt Shellfish has had considerable success breeding the imported Pacific oyster, also known as the Gygus or rock oyster. The parents are fed a rich mix of algae and kept in a tank heated at 25 degrees C to fool the oysters into thinking it's summer and spawn. The resulting larvae are placed in a separate tank where they hatch overnight and start to develop in a very thin shell. After a couple of weeks, they become tiny but perfectly formed oysters. They're grown bigger before being moved outside to the nursery's open tanks and then eventually to the seabed. But unlike these tiny Pacific oysters, the native has a different reproductive pattern, making it much harder to artificially breed.
Natives are much more careful, and it keeps the eggs inside the gill chamber and looks after them there until they're quite a lot bigger and stronger, and so there are fewer eggs, but the survival in principle should be better. We keep the parent stock in artificial conditions, that plenty of food and water at the right temperature, and kid them into thinking it's summer, and then they produce young, plenty of them. But our next problem is to keep them all alive. We feed them in these tanks.
Despite a carefully blended algae-rich diet and ideal conditions, the mortality rate of the native is often as high as 95%. After 4 decades of trying, John Bays has still not cracked the secret, but has not given up. He plans to let them grow to a larger size at a nursery before releasing them onto the seabed. Andy Ridges is one of the few fishermen who fishes for oysters all year round. He works with the Whitstable Oyster Fishery Company, fishing the oysters that they have cultivated on the foreshore. Today's catch includes rock and natives.
I fished the cultivated ones today, so that's not far. That's probably, just quarter of an hour, and then it's a matter of dredging for them during the day and sizing them. So at the end of the day, I return all the small ones and all the small sort of rock oysters and all the small natives in certain areas, and so to fish for them other years. Also in the day, I'm picking up starfish and things like that. Anything that's sort of the oyster's natural predator, I'm sort of removing as I'm going along, if you see what I mean.
Once collected, the oysters are taken to the company's private purification centre. Here they are sorted into trays according to their size and placed in tanks of purified water for a month before they're ready to be eaten. The oyster industry peaked in the 1850s, but then declined due to disease, pollution and a lack of investment. But recent years have seen the industry boosted as bred oysters have increased supplies, and the oyster has become more fashionable and in demand again.
Oysters here have become fairly trendy. You know, there has been sort of, you know, a sort of uptake on oysters, but I think more so also the pressures on fish. You know, fish stocks, quotas. You know, as you probably know now, you can land very little here at the moment, and at least with oysters, we've got the native oyster, which is seasonal, and then we've got the Pacific oyster, which we fish for so many months of the year. So it really meant I've got an all-year-round job.
The Whitstable Oyster Fishery Company has 5 square miles of oyster beds on the foreshore. The company's origins are thought to date back to 1490. It still farms the beds today and supplies its own 3 restaurants with what are claimed to be the only true Royal Whitstable native oysters. In its prime during the mid-19th century, the Whitstable Oyster Fishery Company was sending 80 million oysters a year to London's Billingsgate market. These days, the Royal Native Stores now houses the company's celebrated fish restaurant, which continues to thrive in the town centre.
This building was the Oyster Company headquarters, and it was built on a previous headquarters that dates back before 100 years. So this is about 100 years old, and it was custom built for holding oysters. That's why it's called the Royal Native Oyster Stores. And then this level we're on was where the grading, packing went on, and also we have the offices here. Upstairs is a meeting room, which is a big hall, holds about 400 people, and that was where the fishermen, it was run broadly like a kind of a cooperative. The fishermen had shares and some control over their own destiny. So they needed a meeting place to decide on policy and fine each other and stuff like that. So.
The restaurant attracts visitors from London and all over the world to sample its delicious Whitstable natives. Dishes include grilled rock oysters with spinach and onions, oysters and bacon on toast, and a special oyster chowder. But most locals agree that the best way to enjoy the delicacy of the native is to eat it raw, straight from the shell with a dash of red wine vinegar or lemon. Richard Green believes the Whitstable native is the oyster to rival all others.
Native oysters is very, very rare. That's the main thing. Is, you know, for every 1,000 Jigas, you'll find one native. So they're a very specialised kind of niche market. They're also the native oyster to here, so that whereas the rock oyster was an introduced variety, the native is what you would have found 1,000 years ago. And the meat texture is much firmer. They've got a different taste, a slightly metallic taste. And to a connoisseur, they're considered the best, I think. And I think Whitstable natives, I've tried, you know, I'm not objective obviously, but I've tried a lot of oysters from a lot of places, and the Whitstable natives certainly, I would say, you know, top 1 or 2.
The oyster is a very healthy food, rich in protein and omega-3s that protect the heart and are essential for a balanced diet. They also contain cholesterol-lowering chemicals. As well as being good for you, they're good for the environment and can be grown sustainably.
An oyster is will only take what it needs out of the sea, so it's completely environmentally sustainable. Whereas even a farmer will have to add fertilizer, and occasionally will have to add insecticide or pesticide. An oyster, literally everything it needs is in the sea, and it lives on algae. It also purifies the water. We'd like to see not only our ground but all the estuary here employed for more shellfish production. It's much more sustainable than most types of fishing, and it's a good way of producing a healthy protein that's good for humans with no environmental impact.
The native oyster is a delicious British delicacy that's renowned the world over for its unique flavour and health benefits. If breeding is successful, native oyster production could increase dramatically in the next few years. With continued research, investment and enthusiasm from businesses like those in Whitstable, it's hoped the industry will continue to revive itself and perhaps even return to the glory it achieved in the past.